There we go. Welcome everyone. Welcome to our evening webinar on bats in churches. If this is the first of the series of webinars you've come to, welcome. We're doing 12 this week, all about different aspects of land and nature. And we've timed them to coincide with Churches Count on Nature, which is going on all around the country. We've got more than 300 churches who've registered to take part in Churches Count on Nature, and they're going out into their churchyards and green spaces, and they're spotting the beautiful plants and insects and lichens and birds and maybe bats that they find there, and recording them on the National Biodiversity Network database. And nationally, we decided to chime in with that by running this series of land and nature webinars. In terms of the housekeeping, we use the Q&A for the questions rather than the chat. So if you move your mouse around and find the Q&A, pop any questions that you've got in there, and you'll be able to see other people's questions and click the thumbs up next to the ones that you think are most interesting. The ones with the most votes rise to the top, and the time that we have at the end for questions will start at the one that's got the most thumbs up, and we'll work our way down. After today, it probably won't be this evening, probably tomorrow morning now, I'll send you round the slides, I'll send you any links which are shared in the chat, and a link through to our feedback form. And we're recording the webinars. It'll take us a few days since there are 12 webinars, but we're processing the recordings and we'll get them onto our website in a few days' time. So you'll be able to watch it again or share it with colleagues. I always begin my webinars with trailers for upcoming attractions. These are the webinars we've got left this week on the Devon Living Churchyards project, Eco Church, Beginner's Guide to Biodiversity and Ecology, an introduction to biological recording, and then on Saturday, Sheffield Diocese is doing a whole eco festival tied in with Churches Count on Nature. And you're very welcome. It's an online festival. When I finish doing the introductions, I'll put the links through to the webinars and the Sheffield event in the chat. And then moving away from land and nature, we've got a webinar on heat pumps coming up in July. We've got our 3 Eco Church webinars, one on getting started, one on maintaining momentum, and one on how it links with net zero carbon. And then in September, our 2 fundraising webinars, very importantly, having sessions about environmental fundraising. Right, on to the main event. I'm Catherine Ross. I'm one of the staff who run the Church of England Environment Programme, and I'm based in the Cathedral and Church Buildings Division. And then our speakers tonight are Honor Gay and Ione Fitzpatrick from the Batson Churches team. Honor is one of the engagement officers working hand on hand with churches, and Ione is the communications officer. So without any further ado, if I stop sharing my slides, and I hand over to the 2 of you to lead us off and tell us all about bats in churches.
So hello everybody, thank you so much for joining us on this lovely evening when it seems like summer has come at last. I'm Honor and I'm going to start talking, and there's going to be a slightly clunky handover in the middle when Ione is very kindly going to play a video that I don't have the quite confidence that it will work for me. And then Ione is going to talk about our volunteer survey and hopefully pique your interest in that. So I'm now going to share my screen with that always slightly awkward silence that comes when I'm fiddling around and trying to do this. And I'm going to introduce the project and tell you what we have been doing, the issue, and yes, what we've been doing in the project. So bats in churches. I think most of you are from church communities, and while bats in churches can coexist very happily, sometimes there are more severe issues, and the reason that there is this multi-million-pound 5-year project is really because of the following. So bats are rightly highly protected under the 1981 Wildlife and Countryside Act, and church buildings are really one of the very few places that bats and people actually share space. In your loft, bats are not going to bother you too much, but because of this architecture of churches, bats and people come into much closer proximity when they're in the interior of church buildings. And churches are now disproportionately important bat habitats and roosts because of the impoverishment of the wider countryside, because of the destruction of semi-natural habitats, because of conversion of barns and old buildings, and very often, of course, churchyards are also biodiversity rich. And so bats find refuge in churches, they find sanctuary in churches, and they are also able to forage and find insects in the churchyards. Now, I really want to stress that many, in fact, I would say perhaps most church communities live happily alongside their bats, more or less. But some church communities really struggle with the impact of bats. It's basically poo and wee affecting heritage and also affecting mission and the use of the church. And this causes a lot of distress, and it can even be one of the factors tipping a church into unviability. And this is why the Batson Churches project was conceived, really. And it's all about it's all about conflict resolution. It's a really unusual, a sadly unusual partnership. It's led by Natural England, who put an enormous amount of effort and energy into it. Historic England is a partner, as is the Churches Conservation Trust, the Bat Conservation Trust, and our employer, the Church of England. And really, of course, it's about people as much as bats and heritage. It's about people's attitudes. One of the most important intangible outcomes we're hoping for in the project is to bring entrenched views, to soften entrenched views and bring people together to live alongside their bats. Really, a lot of our job is, alongside practical solutions that I'm going to talk about, it's about giving people the space to be heard, to voice their upset. It's about listening and empathy. And here you can see severe impacts of bats in churches. An alabaster effigy, very damaged and made unsightly by bat droppings. And a church I'm going to be talking about later, covered in plastic sheeting. I think while church communities can keep on top of cleaning, it's normally manageable. But once the cleaning slips, which is of course around volunteers and the will in the community, then a church can quickly become a smelly, unpleasant place which no one wants to get married in, no one wants to use even for worship, let alone for children's activities or other activities. Here are some more adverse impacts. You can see the pitting on the metal, you can see the sheeting, you can see the pitting on brass. And to a more positive side, this is Holy Trinity Tattershall in Lincolnshire. It's one of the richest bat sites in Lincolnshire, full stop. It's got 8 species of bats. We have 18 species in Britain. Tattershall is a sanctuary for 8 species, and they love their bats. They use their bats as a mascot for fundraising, and they kind of get on with quite a lot of adverse impacts. So here are our project churches, and I noticed when somebody identified themselves from Norfolk, you can see that there is a massive preponderance of churches in East Anglia. I have a colleague, Diana, whose job is focused completely on Norfolk. I think this is partly because the churches are so magnificent and complex, and it's also partly because often the worshipping congregations are very small, and also because there's been a huge amount of land use change, and there aren't many other places for bats in quite a lot of Norfolk. So what I'm mostly going to talk about is separating bats and people. This is a really important part of the project, and it's quite a complicated process. So basically, the project is hoping to trial these approaches so that parishes will be able to undertake them beyond the project. I must say I have slight doubts about this because as you'll see, it's a complicated and arduous process. The first thing is that a special license has been developed for the project, a Batson Churches license. And the project engages ecologists at 20 churches across 20 worst affected churches across England. And in the summer of 2019 and again this summer, they are doing really in-depth dusk and dawn surveys to determine what those bats are doing in that church. So it's a very bespoke survey for that church. They work with the church architect and the PCC, and they come up with a bat management plan where they outline options for separating the church community from the bats. That normally involves capital works, as you will see, and so faculty has to be applied for. Not only does faculty have to be applied for, but once faculty is obtained, which, as I'm sure you all know, can be quite a long process, the site needs to be registered with Natural England and the work needs to be licensed. So there's another round of permissions. Added to that, the work has to take place in order to accommodate the bats in very specific timing periods to coincide, so that it doesn't coincide with when they are roosting. We pay for this work, the project. We have to set up payment and communication systems. And also, last but not least, or in fact not last, first, we have to build the team. So the ecologist and the architect have to gain mutual respect. Very often church architects are pretty negative about bats. They're a nuisance, they stop works, they damage stuff. And we need to kind of bring the ecologist and the architect and the PCC together. So I'm hoping, but I think Ione's going to tell me when I run out of time, to be able to talk to you about 4 churches in various parts of the country where we've implemented different solutions. St Mary Weatherden, a beautiful Grade 1 listed church in Suffolk, not one of those massive, magnificent Suffolk churches, but pretty fine nonetheless. You can see there's a beautiful Annunciation lily just outside the door. And this absolutely magnificent Suffolk hammerbeam roof, which is like a forest for bats. So there is a really important roost of natterers bats in this church that caused enormous disquiet and upset to a very active worshipping community. They only moved in when nearby trees were felled for the bypass. It is in the agribusiness landscape of Suffolk, so it's really important for the bats and an enormous nuisance for the congregation. Actually, in the middle, in the hatchment over towards the left of the screen, I don't know if you can see, but that is where the roost is, and you can almost see the scattering of droppings. There you can see it very much better. You can see how this amazing medieval woodwork has shifted, and this is where the bats are roosting and pooing. There is a picture of the natterers bats. Natterers bats are loyal to their churches. They don't have many other options. So we have to be specially careful. If you like, they're not a very Catholic species of bat. They're quite faithful to their roosts. And the solution, we hired a really good ecologist who you'll actually see in a video later, Chris Damant. And his solution was to install 3 rafter boxes in the eaves, invisible from the interior, accessed from the exterior, so that the bats can go in and roost in the rafter boxes, but they can no longer fly into the church. Here you can see the contractor having a closer look. You can see the droppings and you can see this remarkable woodwork. I'm just going to follow now with some pictures showing the installation of the eaves, and I will slightly whiz through these, the eaves boxes. So there you can see the lead coming off. This work was also halted in the first COVID lockdown. The lead is being stripped off. The rafter boxes are being installed in the bottom right-hand corner. There they are. There they are. And so far the bats are, so this year the bats are able to access the interior of the church because the rafter boxes are more of a through than a rafter box. And if they take to the rafter boxes and they use the access, this autumn they will be sealed up so that the bats are confined to the boxes and they can no longer access the interior of the church. Here, monitoring is happening and the bats are using the rafter boxes, so they haven't been disturbed by the work. St Lawrence Radstone in Northamptonshire, very near the path of HS2, is a very, very sad case. This church, despite an active community, was unofficially closed because of the impact of bats. You can see here, this is horrible. This is dead bats, droppings, smelly, really not a good advertisement for bats at all. It's a grade 1 listed church, and the bats again are Natterer's bats. And these bats have not been at the church that long, because in the 90s a pipistrelle was found in the church, and it was so unusual that somebody wrote a poem about the pipistrelles. They weren't quite so happy about the situation before the project with the Natterers. Now, the bats were the picture on the right of the screen shows that there are two different sorts of roofs. In fact, this shows it much better. At the bottom of the screen is the medieval nave roof. At the top of the screen is the Victorian chancel roof, a beautiful bit of woodwork, but not as significant in heritage terms as the medieval roof. And this was the key to the mitigation, because the little red arrow shows where the bats were getting in. The architect, Adrian Ringrose, and the ecologist, Chris Damant, suggested boxing in the chancel roof to create a very large void. This is a really good bit of mitigation. The bats have a lot of room to move around in. You can see it's made the church really light, really beautiful. So far, it's working. The bats are using their void. And the Redstone went from this to having a Christmas service for the first time in years. So hopefully that's a success story. I want now to talk about a beautiful church in Bedfordshire, in many ways the quintessential parish church, St Lawrence Willington. And they had, as you will see, a big problem. St Lawrence Willington, I'll just run through the heritage very quickly. It was substantially rebuilt by a man called Adam Gostwick, who navigated the reign of Henry VIII, worked for both Wolsey and Cromwell, and he built himself a magnificent manor at Willington, sadly completely gone apart from this marvellous dovecot and stables. Here is the interior of the dovecot, now in the care of the National Trust. The church is church, interestingly, is only grade 2 listed, which I think is acknowledged as an error, but it's got these wonderful funerary monuments and John Gostwick's helmet that he wore to the cloth of gold. Ione is now, I'm going to stop screen sharing at this point, and Ione, I hope, is going to play a video that will tell you what we did at St Lawrence Willington far better than I can. Ione.
Oops. So if Honor, you could just give me a thumbs up if you can hear this well.
We love conservation. We love the environment and conservation and looking after God's world. It's living with the effects of having some of the conservation within the building. It's not like having them in your loft at home, for example. It's more like having them in your dining room.
Rather than looking at it as destructive, there's a lot of negative interaction. In other words, when the bats are roosting, there'll be droppings falling out of the roost onto the floor. So somebody's got to come in and do a lot of cleaning before all these events take place.
Particularly for those who have the role of being volunteer cleaners, it's disheartening. They can come in and clean, spend 2 or 3 hours cleaning, and then they go home and within a couple of hours, it's as if they'd never been here. They don't want to get rid of the bats. They just want to reduce the burden the bats are placing on them and the church, so they can carry on the functions of the church. So a lot of my challenge is about how to try and solve that, how to accommodate both the needs of the people whilst also bats.
The reason that bats like buildings like this is it's the closest they can get probably to ancient woodland. And what you've got here is a tall enclosed place like a woodland ride with nice wooden structures up at the top, like the tops of trees where they can find roosts. So it's an ideal place for them.
So last year we did 4 surveys here, dawn and dusk. In fact, I actually slept here the night between the surveys, which was lovely. I think where we're sitting now. But what it meant is we could watch the bats' behaviour. From the bats would come out of a beam at the top of the roof. They'll fly around inside the church, circling around before they gather at the chancel and exit the building through the small gap in the stained glass window. They'll then fly off and forage. They might come back occasionally during the night, so you've got regular bats coming in and out. But the bulk of the activity is at dusk. And then at dawn, they tend to gather outside the church, outside the stained glass window where there's a hole. They'll, again, socialise, chattering away before entering inside the church.
It was a very interesting case, this, because it was important for the ecologist, Chris, to find out how bats were using the church. And he then came forward with proposals. One, to filter the bats coming into the church into a new bat box inside the chancel. Now, that was going to be quite obvious, and therefore the architect designed a new hatchment, effectively, a modern hatchment to cover the bat box and make it seem fitting and appropriate within the church.
So once we've a new external access points where they're roosting, we can look at potentially creating a new roosting point around the bat access, which is how we arrived at creating a rather charming bespoke bat box with the heraldic shields on it that honour some of the historical families associated with the church.
I think what we're looking at now is a longer term relationship between the bat group and hopefully quite a few church communities, not just in Willington, but in other places as well.
So we've got the bats and our responsibility to them. We've got the building and our responsibility as stewards of a beautiful historic building. And we've also got the living community, the church, the people who meet here week in, week out, and the people from the village for whom this is their church. And now, with the introduction of the Batson Churches class licenses, all three of those have an equal voice.
That's it.
Ione, thank you so much. I'm afraid the quality of that was not really very brilliant, but I hope that you got the picture of what a partnership it is. And I would say that for any of you who are from church communities who, well, if you're interested in biodiversity, the bat groups, county bat groups, are an amazing and wonderful resource. And some of them are so active, so do reach out to them. Oh, that's a Natterer's bat, there we go. Oh, and my final church is the lovely brick church. I always get excited when I see this church because it's one of the relatively few churches built of brick of Chignallsmealy in Essex. And this is quite a different, much more low-key, much more, much cheaper solution, really. You can see there's just a few pictures of this amazing, simple brick interior and hugely excitingly a brick font. Not the only brick font in England, but there are certainly not many. So Chignallsmealy has, can you see this charming long-eared, brown long-eared bat, and also our friends, the Natterer's bats. And there was quite severe damage. You can see the pitting on these lovely Victorian tiles and also on the memorial stone. And particularly upsetting for the community was this damage to the war memorials. There's another, there we are. And what we did was a relatively simple solution. Our heritage advisor, Rachel, commissioned these beautiful bespoke oak frames. You can see this one open, which will now protect the war memorial from any further damage from bat urine. And you can see it now on the left of the picture, and it, just to be honest, looks as if it's always been there. So that's a real nice success story and very, very simple. So just to sum up where we are, we're not sure of success because bats are wild creatures and the mitigations are experimental. And so the next couple of years will really show us whether the bats take to their new homes. We really, really don't want the bat populations to decrease, whether the new homes work in terms of separating the churches and the bats. What I'd really like to stress also is attitudes to bats and scale of damage are really not correlated. I have some very, very upset church communities with relatively little damage, but their perception, their reality is that it's too much for them and they don't want to share their church with bats. Tattershall, you saw, completely overrun with bats. The soprano pipistrelle colony is 750 individuals, and soprano pipistrelles are quite smelly, dirty little bats, and they live alongside them. And with some churches, we can't put mitigation in because of the architecture of the church or the nature of the bats. In my last few minutes, I'm just going to talk a bit about other things that the project does. So we do bat walks. We work with bat groups to lead bat walks, which are hugely transformative in terms of attitudes to bats. We really find the more people know about bats and understand them, the more myths we can bust that they are like rodents, they have lots of young, they carry disease, the more people soften towards them. We do a lot on conservation cleaning. Our heritage advisor, Rachel, here is demonstrating long-handled brushwork and conserving brass. So we help churches with cleaning, and that is really, really popular. We do a lot of activities. This is a village fete where you can see we've got some very simple activities on doing bat masks. And we've also got bat information sheets. And in fact, if you would like any of these, just get in touch with us, because we will very, very happily send you some information sheets. Particularly found a sick, grounded or injured bat. That's really, really useful. All it remains for me to say is thank you very, very much for listening. Hope you've got lots of questions. And I'm now going to stop screen sharing and hand over to Ione. Over to you, Ione.
Lovely. Got to unmute myself. That is the absolute Zoom classic, isn't it? So yes, I am going to talk to you about the Bats in Churches study, which is how you can get involved in the project, or you can encourage other people to get involved on our behalf. So I'll just start slide showing. I was meant to play another video during this, but if the quality wasn't good, as Honor said, I think I'll just tell you the information in the video, and I can always share that link afterwards if you're interested in watching. It's just a little video about the study that we made before, but it's not essential to the talk, to be honest. I'll just chat my way through it. So yes, taking part in the Bats in Churches study. So the study itself is, we're asking members of the public to go into their local church, or perhaps their favorite church, or a church which they've gone past maybe lots of times and they've never gone into, and to go and have a look for evidence of bats. And you saw some examples of evidence of bats in Honor's talk, actually, lots of evidence, and we don't expect that there'll be evidence such as those quite dramatic pictures of droppings absolutely everywhere, but there might be the evidence might be collections of droppings, which you now are all experts on, splashes of urine, or even collections of moth wings or insect legs, where the bats have been having an absolute feast in the church. So yes, this is where I was going to play my lovely video, but unfortunately that's not going to happen. So yeah, there's over 16,000 churches in the Church of England estate in England. So there's so many opportunities for going into. You can go into any one of these churches and have a look. And here's some pictures of some of what the surveys entail, which is Claire on the left, who's actually running our survey. She's taking some pictures in the church, which is part of it. And Rachel on the right is having a look under pews for any of this evidence. And then the bottom there, you've just got a couple of droppings, which are some of the evidence that you might find. So why are we doing these surveys? Well, the overarching thing really is that we want to have a better understanding of how bats are using churches the whole way across the country. At the moment, we have kind of estimates. The last time some data was collected countrywide was from 95, I believe, which was obviously quite a long time ago and is pretty out of date. And as Honor had said, all it takes is one collection of trees to be cut down or felled, and the bats will have moved. So obviously a lot has happened since the 90s in terms of development. So we expect those figures to be quite different. So we are hoping to find out how many churches are housing bats across the country. And if we can get enough people doing these surveys, then we should have a really good idea. And from that, we'll be able to draw some national and perhaps regional trends, because as Honor mentioned, in Norfolk, there's a lot of bats using churches for many different reasons. And it's to do with the kind of landscape around and the availability of other roosting opportunities. Whereas in a different part of the country, it might be much less. So that'll be really useful to know that. Also, which factors are affecting bats' use of churches? So the survey also entails a questionnaire with a church warden. And if they should be able to give some information to the participants on some of the structures within the church. So, for instance, a church which has roof voids, churches in general having roof voids, we might find out are more likely to house bats, or churches in general that have mature trees in the churchyard might be more likely to house bats. So that'll be useful to know as well. And finally, I think probably, and I'm sure Honor would agree with me, the most important one really is what are church perspectives towards those bats? So where bats are present, and our participants will find this out from the questions that they ask, that if there are bats that are there enough for the church warden to know, they might have some takeaways from that. We've found that the impacts are negative and it's been difficult to deal with, and the cleaning burden has been high, or perhaps they could be really positive, like some of our churches where they've really embraced the bats and they use them for public engagement, bat walks, they've got information up on the walls, that kind of thing. So all of this together will allow us to draw up better guidance for church communities living with bats, ultimately better protect the heritage inside the church and also protect bats in the long term. So if you go onto our website, hopefully some of you will, and I've got the address down there again at the bottom, which will take you directly to our webpage. And Catherine can share that afterwards. I'm sure she wouldn't mind doing that as well. You'll come through to this page where you make an account essentially, and you select a church. And then you'll soon find out that there are two types of surveys that you'll end up doing depending on the church which you select. So the first type of survey is very kind of light touch, as it were. It's just doing the questionnaire with your church representative. And you'll be pleased to know this is in a very COVID secure manner. So once you've signed up, you'll be issued with COVID secure information to make sure that you can do this as safely as possible. And it is worth saying as well that the churches do reserve the right to decline to take part in the study. And if that's the case, which is absolutely up to them, although we do hope, and if any of you are looking after churches, we hope you will see the benefit in this kind of research because of some of the difficulties like Honor has outlined in her talk before. So yeah, if you will you'll do your nice questionnaire with the church warden, and then you'll go in and just have a look for evidence, like we had said. And that's the majority of the churches. If you're lucky enough to select a priority church, these have been randomly sampled so that we can just have a kind of deep dive into some of the churches and just get a better idea of what's really going on, rather than just bats yes or bats no. This one, with gloves on, you will collect a few of the droppings, and you'll know that those are bat droppings rather than rodent droppings by doing what we call the Crumble Test, which is quite good fun if you're into that kind of thing. Is to, wearing gloves, pick up a bat dropping, and if you just squish it between your fingers, it'll either crumble to dust, because bat droppings are made of insect exoskeletons, so they're really just dust. Or if it's rodent dropping, if you squish it, it'll just squash, really, which is lovely. You'll know you've got the wrong kind of droppings. So collect some droppings, and also we're asking you to put a bat detector. It'll all be sent to you, all pre-programmed, in the church for 2 nights, and then you'll send that back. And through the sound analysis of the bat detector of whatever been collected, and through the DNA analysis of the droppings, we'll be able to tell not only if bats are present or not present, but actually the species of bat that is living in the church, which is obviously really, really valuable data. And it's really this data which will give us an idea of kind of the regional trends of what kinds of bats are using churches more kind of specifically. So we have a bit of data so far. And of the, from last year, unfortunately, we had to do a shorter survey season. So we didn't quite manage to do as much as we would have hoped. But we did get lots of volunteers anyway, who did it in August. And we've now surveyed 115 churches. And of those churches that were surveyed, 70% found evidence of bats. So the estimate from the 90s was 60% of medieval churches. And now we think that's quite a conservative number because these churches aren't just medieval, they're churches from any age. And you can't, this is very preliminary data, so you don't want to draw any conclusions, but 70% of any kind of church is a lot higher than 60% of one specific kind of particularly historic churches. So we expect that there will be an awful lot more churches with bats living in them than was previously estimated in the 90s. And for a quick little bat top trumps living in the churches, so our biggest winner so far has been the brown long-eared bat, which was most commonly seen. Is here with his trophy for being the most common bat. And then that was followed by the common pipistrelle, which you might have seen flying around your gardens. I think that's what is flying around my garden, although I haven't been able to collect any droppings to ID it. And then coming in next was the soprano pipistrelle, and this lovely guy in between some orange woodwork here. And then finally was ceratines, which are also lovely furry bats, all of them. And it's quite nice to see their faces up close because they're not as scary as some people think they are. I always think they look like little dogs or puppies or something. So this is almost my last slide, but yeah, these numbers are a little old actually. So I now know that over 700 people have signed up to survey churches, which is really exciting. So hopefully we'll come in with a lot more churches, but the ones we really need people to sign up for are those priority churches. And on the homepage, once you click through to register, you'll see a map of all the priority churches. So if you are keen on getting involved in the surveys, then, if there is one near you, please do bite the bullet and go for a priority church. And then it's exciting for you as well, because you get to actually find out what species is living in that church that you surveyed, which is kind of quite fun to know a bit more about the bats. And like I said before, if you're looking after a church, please do consider taking part, because these aren't like legal surveys. So if you are doing building works, you might need to pay for a proper survey, but it can be a good flag to say, yes, there could be bats here or not. Because if you start doing building works and it's all planned and everything, and then you have to stop halfway through because someone discovers evidence of bats, that's just worse delayed. I always think it's better to be prepared in advance. So and it's good fun to take part. And even if you are looking after a church, you could perhaps survey your own church or survey one in the benefice or something like that too. Yeah, so that's all from me. I think we've got some time for questions. There's the website again, if you want to find out a bit more about the surveys. And also there's our Twitter, which we're encouraging people who do take part in the surveys to share their experiences, any photos, anything they learned, anything they thought was fun, anything they thought was hopefully nothing they thought was awful, with the hashtag #ChurchBatDetectives. So yes, thank you very much. I'll pass back to Catherine now.
Brilliant. Thank you both so much. It's quite sobering, isn't it? Looking at those pictures at the beginning on with the damage that can be caused, but then really optimistic seeing the practical solutions that are being put in place to allow the people and the bats to live in harmony, hopefully. So it's time for Q&A. If everyone joining this looks at the list of Q&A, you can find it by clicking on the little icon down the bottom. And you'll see questions other people have already put in. You can add a question if you've got one, or you can click thumbs up next to the questions you're most interested in, and they'll rise to the top. Whilst people have a little look at those and decide which one they want to click on, Honor, can you just say, if somebody's joining from a church that's already in the Bats in Churches project, they would know about it, wouldn't they? If they're joining from another church that's not covered by the project, are there things they can access through you, or is there any support for a church out there that's maybe got a problem with bats but isn't part of the Bats in Churches project?
There really is, Catherine. Thanks. That's a really, really great question. So if you are from a church and you want to know more about your bats, or you're oppressed by your bats, do please get in touch. We have a project email, or just I've put my own email in the chat. Please do get in touch with me. What we can offer is linking you to the county bat group, which I think long term is a really, really good solution, because understanding your bats is the first step towards living alongside them. We can also visit ourselves. We can offer cleaning advice. If we are running cleaning workshops near you, we can invite you. We can, you know, I deal with a lot of project churches, not a lot of non-project churches, phone calls, meetings. So yes, please do get in touch. And really what we can do depends on your situation. We can come and do events. We can, yes, there's a lot we can do.
Lovely, thank you. Right, let's look at the Q&A. So the first question at the moment is from Judith, who says, if more funding was available for bat surveys and help with costs, which can be very expensive for churches, churches might be more amenable to their bats. A few years ago, free surveys were available, and now it seems that they're not. Why is this? And I guess there's a broader question there about, are there any ways to get funding for those kind of surveys?
I think that's something that the project has really, I think if churches with bats had relationships with ecologists like they do with church architects, the situation would be really, really different. And this is going to sound a little bit like a broken record, but I think if you can encourage churches to contact bat groups they're quite specialist societies, and really anyone from a bat group here would forgive me for saying they are full of geeks, people who love bats. For example, in Surrey, where I live, two churches have got in touch with me, two non-project churches. Surrey Bat Group is carrying out free in-depth surveys at both those churches. Now, that's not par for the course everywhere, but I would say contact your bat group, and also I think it is worth contacting ecologists and explaining, if you haven't got, I mean, PCCs, no one expects PCCs to be rolling in it. So I think quite often ecologists will do things at cost or even at a loss. And very often consultant ecologists are members of their bat group. So that's a really, really good way in. Ione, have you got anything any ideas about relationships with ecologists?
Yeah, well, like you said, a lot of these ecologists have really dedicated their lives to their art, as it were, and some of them will do things pro bono, offer some advice, certainly. If you're worried about having bats in your church and you don't know if you've got them or not, you can also call, I don't know if you mentioned this, Honor, sorry.
Oh, no, I didn't. No, very good.
You can also call the Bat Helpline, which the National Bat Helpline, which you can find the number for that on the Bat Conservation Trust website. And they can offer some free advice for churches that think that there might be bats there. And they might recommend that you should get a survey done, but you get a free volunteer bat roost visitor who'll come out and look to see whether there's bats or not, if they think there is, and then they'll send a letter afterwards which will outline what they've found and what their recommendations are. So as kind of a first port of call, if you're pretty sure you've got bats, I would say that's a good cost-effective way of going.
That's really good. The other thing that I hear from a lot of our project ecologists is, a lot of their work is very, very depressing. It's working on big developments. It's licensing destruction, and actually they really like working with churches. So if you need a cheap survey, I'd say be bold and ask for one.
Very good. Right, the next question says, are bats affected by churches with active bell towers? That's a very interesting question.
It's a very interesting question, and it's not the first time we've been asked this. So apparently, if a bat is in a bell tower, there's a roost in a bell tower and the bells are rung regularly, the bats put up with it, which seems astonishing. But if the bats are in a silent bell tower and then the bells get rung, that can be upsetting for them. And bats are not often, bats in the belfry, it's a misnomer. Bats are generally in nice warm places. Bell towers are often too drafty, too cold. Where they really like to be is, this quite often in the south transept, south side, and then when it gets really hot, they might migrate over to the north side, but they're not often in the bell tower.
How interesting. The next question says, it is so sad when bats lose their habitats due to development or new infrastructure. Do you have any input or provide support to parishes to feed into development plans to stop this happening in the future? Surely developers should be paying for new habitats and mitigation measures.
So where developers do license, bat roost disturbance or destruction is licensed, developers do have to provide alternatives. The trouble is the effectiveness is not monitored. And I would say that if you are, I totally empathize with that. And the project itself does not do that, but it's really worth talking to the Bat Conservation Trust and your county bat group. I wonder if every answer of mine is going to say the county bat group. Now, also, if you happen to be in an area where the county bat group is perhaps absent or doesn't have much capacity, your local wildlife trust is also a very good port of call.
Is it as simple, if people want to find their county bat group, do they literally Google the name of their county and then bat group?
Yes, or they can ask us, because we might be able to make a named introduction. Yes. For example, Norfolk is a very interesting case. There is no Norfolk bat group, but there is a sort of bat group centred around Norwich City, and there is a remarkable man. One of the reasons there are so many churches in we know there are so many bats in churches in Norfolk is because of one man's endeavours, a remarkable ecologist called Phil Parker, who is a consultant but also does a load of pro bono work for churches. And so, there's that kind of recording bias that Phil has dedicated his life to bats in churches in Norfolk. And so the situation can be nuanced. So I do Google, but also do ask us as well.
I just put in the chat.
I was just going to say that some, as Anna kind of had touched on there, some bat groups are very active and are very well organised. Like Devon Bat Group, for instance, is sort of always doing events and things and really on it. Whereas some bat groups, it depends kind of what members you've got at the time. So it does go up and down, and there are some that are more active than others. So you do kind of have to be a little bit lucky to be in a, not lucky, I mean, there are lots of them are active, but just worth mentioning that as well. They're not all bat groups are created equal.
No, absolutely. Which is why the Wildlife Trust can also be the good second port of call.
Lovely, thank you. So the next question says, what if you can only see the bats accessing the church externally with no sign of them in the interior of the church? Are you still interested?
If you're interested, we're interested. That sounds like a nice. They might, of course, be. I think pipistrelles. I'm not a bat expert, I should say, but I think a lot of the bats might be roosting under tiles. They might not even be accessing the interior of the church. They might be just finding nice, cozy crevices on the outside. But there's also a lot you can do to enhance the churchyard for bats. And the surroundings, and bats really. There's just been a report by Bat Conservation Trust that legislation and awareness, 5 bat species have increased in numbers, and the rest are stable. So protection and awareness have really turned things around, actually. But any action people can do is helpful.
I'm wondering if that question referred to the survey. So if there are bats coming to the church but not coming into the church, are they still covered by the survey only?
Well, yes, because even a answer to the survey, I mean, this is the age-old thing with data and research, is even a no is useful. So if you go into, all churches are covered by the survey, every single one, well, Church of England churches, I should say, and Churches Conservation Trust churches, so not any other dominion. But if you if you go into, it's all worthwhile data, because if some churches you don't go into and you don't find evidence inside, then that is just quality data that shows that there's more bats in churches in another area than there is in that area. So it honestly, it could be any kind, and that'll still be useful. And I believe there is like a notes section, and so this data will be used to update the church heritage record, which is kind of a record which the Church of England has of what's going on in all of the churches. So even if it's them going from the externally, that data will still be used, definitely.
Very good. The next question is from Charles, who says, will the planting of more trees, I'm struggling to read this, right, let's try again. With the planting of more trees, will the bats move back to the trees? So if you plant new trees, will they leave the church and go to the trees?
So they are wild animals. Possibly or possibly not. Bat populations in church do fluctuate. I mean, planting the right kind of trees in the right place generally has enormous biodiversity benefits. But and for sure, if bats are roosting in a church and they can come out into a tree cover, that is really good, because they come out and they're not exposed to predators. But they may or they may not. So that's no answer. But they may or they may not.
My memory from a bat walk I went on with our local wildlife trust was that they particularly liked roosting in crevices in old dead trees. Because I remember them saying, to make them safe, but not to take down and clear away dead trees, because the bats like to go in those. So is that about right? So actually they'd rather the older trees than any new ones that you plant?
Yes, that is absolutely right. And of course, but churches, complex buildings, I mean, churches are perfect for bats. Churches are really wonderful sanctuaries for bats. So yes, actually, Charles, a sapling, bats are not going to flock out of a nice church to a sapling. It's unlikely.
If you think about kind of just the biology of where they're choosing to roost as well, they're choosing narrow crevices, holes and things like that. And if you've got new trees, you've seen what the trunk looks like on a young tree. It's really smooth. There's not really much place to get involved in. But where you've got big flaky bark and things like that, and those huge old trees, but you can't just plonk down a mature tree. It just doesn't work that way, unfortunately. But yeah, there's a lot of woodland management, and bat ecologists are always involved in bat surveys when forestry is going on, and they'll do a lot of really interesting stuff at the moment that changes all the time. Exactly as Catherine says, they'll fell the trees, but they won't fell them all the way down to the stump. They'll leave them up and provide roosting spaces for bats and for birds.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. The next question is about street lighting. Is there anything which can mitigate nearby bright street lighting?
Oh, if street lighting is affecting bats, then it can be and should be changed. There's a lot of intelligence about lighting and bats, and a lot of seminars ARAP does. So awareness of the impact of lighting on bats is quite high. If you suspect that, I would get in touch with the Bat Conservation Trust and the Wildlife Trust and the Bat Group, because that can be changed, can't it, Ione? That should be changed.
Yeah, there's some I actually did go to one of these, ended up it is just an amazing job that me and Honor are in, but I ended up in a seminar of exactly this, and it was quite technical, but the kind of long and short of it is, now there's been so much lighting which has been designed to different ways of doing it. So for instance, instead of having lighting that's like this going out in all directions, you have lighting which is like this and just goes narrow straight down to the street. There's lots of ways, and a different number of lumens, and gosh, that you wouldn't believe the amount of research which has gone into lighting and bats. It's absolutely very well covered area, and if you look online, you'll find just reams of information about it, some of it quite dense. But as Honor says, yeah, the Bat Conservation Trust can give you so much information on that.
Now we've got 4 questions left and 4 minutes. So
okay, we'll be very
quick fire.
Short and snappy answers, we can probably get through everyone's questions. So the second half of Neville's question was, does netting confuse the bat's echolocation? I'm not sure what netting he means, but in general, do things
I think I can answer this.
Brilliant.
No, the netting doesn't confuse them. They can't echolocate the netting, because that's how you use to capture bats. You use netting actually some bats, the older bats can go around it, but the young immature bats don't really understand as well, or don't pick it up. So the problem with netting is it's a very effective way of catching bats if you're doing some research, but obviously if you're not doing that, they can get tangled in it. Honor, did you have?
Yeah, it is illegal to put so bird netting, you have to be very, very careful about the mesh size so that it doesn't capture bats, because obviously if you put something in that disturbs or damages bats, that is a wildlife crime.
How long does it take to get a bat license for urgent work with an at-risk ceiling after the 2 emergency surveys have been done?
Oh, well, unfortunately too long, because Natural England has had such cuts over the last 10 years that generally they were saying they could turn around a license in 4 weeks, but currently it's 12.
And
what you can do is, you're not supposed, sorry Catherine, this is quite useful though, and I'll be very quick. You are supposed to register the site when you have got faculty, but I think if you do have to do urgent works, it is very well worth asking the ecologist to register the site as faculty is going in, and saying that you will provide evidence of the faculty, because obviously if it's sequential, then you really are looking at a long time.
What is the best time of day to carry out the survey?
So any time of day really, but if the church has very assiduous cleaners, I would probably recommend going in the morning, because the bats are doing all their droppings really, the majority, when they get scattered all over the place, that tends to be in the night time. So I would probably try and do it before the cleaners have gone in. But of course you will have got permission from the church representative, so you could also say, please could you tell me a day when the cleaners aren't going to come, because they won't be coming every single day, and in which case then you could go any time of day really.
Is the information collected as part of the project passed to local record centres? So it's going on to the National Biodiversity Network, isn't it, which all record centres would have access to?
Yeah. I think Catherine probably knows slightly better about the records, the Church of England's records, but yes, essentially that information is kind of being shared and is available to anyone who wants to use it and pass the project, because of course the project finishes in September 2023. So all of everything we collect in the project, and all of the kind of resources we create, and the guidance and all the really useful stuff is going to be available long term.
And then the final question, is there a plan to include other denominations? There are over 4,000 Methodist churches in the UK.
Oh
yeah. Well, quite joyfully, I hope. The Bat Conservation Trust, who is one of our partners and is absolutely the knowledge on bats in this country, they are really keen on continuing the surveys after the end of the tenure of the project. And it is also Claire, who sits within the Bat Conservation Trust, is the one leading on the surveys. So they know exactly how it's been hosted. So they're in a really good position to continue doing the surveys. And we hope they'll open it up to more. There's no reason to not. I suppose it just relies on the buy-in from kind of the church representatives of those places.
And and in terms of help and advice, actually, we are helping a beautiful non-denominational chapel in Suffolk. If other denominations want to get in touch with us, basically we are trying to help worshipping communities live with their bats. Obviously, we're employed by the Church of England, but we will engage.
Well, thank you. That's a lovely answer. So it sounds like the summary in terms of what people should do next are email you if they've got questions from today, contact their local county bat group, contact their local wildlife trust, and click through on your link, Ione, and volunteer to do a survey in a church near to them.
Perfectly
Yes, please.
summarised, Catherine.
Lovely. That's just gone 7 o'clock. Thank you both so much for coming along and speaking tonight. It's been so interesting and very practical. It's been so interesting looking at those real examples, Honor, of the work that's going on to help bats and people coexist. Thank you to everyone who's come along and joined us tonight. I do hope you'll make it along to one of our other webinars this week. I'll send you an email. It'll be tomorrow morning. That'll have the slides, the links, and the link through to our feedback form. Thank you all for joining. I will just save the chat and then I will bring us to a close.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you